A millionaire saves a homeless woman from a fire and discovers she's the heir to a fortune. But what he asked in return left everyone in shock. Before we start the story, comment below. Where are you watching from? Enjoy the story. Lucas Smith, a millionaire, was driving his luxury car down a deserted street in the silent early morning hours. Everything seemed normal until he saw something unexpected. An abandoned building on fire. He was about to drive past when he noticed someone in the middle of the smoke. A woman, alone, struggling to escape. His heart raced. On impulse, he hit the brakes hard and jumped out of the car. Seconds later, Lucas was carrying the unconscious young woman out of the building. Her face was covered in dirt, her breathing weak. He laid her on the ground, trying to process what had just happened. Minutes later, the building collapsed. Lucas watched to see if she was still alive and noticed that her clothes were dirty and worn and her hair was messy. That's when he realized she was homeless. She had probably been living in that abandoned building. Firefighters arrived moments later, followed by ambulances. A paramedic ran over, checking the girl's vital signs. "She needs oxygen," the paramedic said. "Do you know her?" Lucas looked at her for a moment. No, he didn't know her. But he couldn't bring himself to say it out loud. "No," he finally replied, "but I'll go with you." Inside the ambulance, Lucas watched the unconscious young woman. Her chest rose and fell slowly, still weak from the smoke. What had happened to her? How had someone so young and fragile ended up in an abandoned building? Those questions echoed in his mind as the ambulance sped toward the hospital, unaware that this encounter would change his life forever. The hospital room was quiet. Lucas Smith sat in a chair beside the bed, watching the unconscious woman. Now that her face was clean, her delicate features were visible. Despite her fragile appearance, something about her intrigued him. He didn't understand why he was still there. He had already done his part. He could have left as soon as the ambulance arrived, but something kept him from just walking away. The next morning, a doctor entered the room. "She was lucky," he said, checking the patient's vital signs. "But she needs rest and medical care. We didn't find any identification on her. Do you know anything about her family?" Lucas shook his head. "I have no idea who she is." "Well, she'll need someone to take responsibility for her until she recovers." Lucas frowned. He didn't have time for this. But for some reason, before he could refuse, he heard himself saying, "I'll take care of it." 3 days later, the woman finally woke up. Her eyes blinked a few times before settling on him. There was confusion and fear in them. "Where am I?" Her voice was weak. "In the hospital," Lucas answered. "You were trapped in a fire." She tried to sit up, but immediately winced in pain. Who are you?" "Lucas Smith." She nodded slowly, as if processing the information. I'm Grace." That was all she could say before her eyes filled with tears. Lucas watched her, unsure of what to say. She looked lost. Who was she? How had she ended up there? He wanted answers, and he knew exactly how to get them. The next day, Lucas hired a private investigator to find out everything about Grace. He wasn't sure why. Maybe it was just curiosity, or maybe it was something else. The report came back quickly, and it revealed something shocking. Grace wasn't just some unknown woman. She was the heir to one of the country's greatest fortunes. The daughter of a powerful businessman who had vanished years ago. She had mysteriously disappeared after an accident. With no memory of her past, she had ended up living on the streets. Lucas closed the report, his mind racing. If she regained her memory, she would inherit an empire far bigger than his own. And what if, before that happened, she became his wife? He would have control over everything. It was a risky plan, but Lucas never backed down from a challenge. That night, when he returned to the hospital, he found Grace sitting up in bed, staring out the window. She turned when she noticed him. "You're still here," Lucas smirked. "Looks like it." There was a brief silence before he finally said, "I want to help you, Grace." She frowned. "Why would you help someone like me?" Lucas stepped closer, his expression calm. "Because you have no one." She looked away, clearly affected by his words. Then he made his next move. "I want you to come live with me, until you recover." Grace's eyes widened. "What?" Lucas leaned in slightly. "Trust me." Grace stared at him for a long moment. Then slowly she nodded. And just like that, without knowing it, she had signed herself into the biggest game of Lucas Smith's life. Lucas Smith's mansion was the complete opposite of Grace's reality. She looked around as he guided her through the massive entrance hall. The marble floor gleamed under the crystal chandelier. The furniture was pristine, and the place radiated luxury and sophistication. "This will be your room." Lucas said, opening a door. Grace walked in slowly, as if afraid to touch anything. The room was larger than any space she had ever slept in. The soft bed, clean sheets, private bathroom. It all seemed surreal. "I can't accept this," she murmured, turning to him. Lucas gave a faint smile. "You already did." She had no choice, nowhere else to go, and he knew it. In the following days, Lucas played his role perfectly. He was kind and attentive, making sure Grace had everything she needed. He brought in doctors to check on her, hired a stylist to buy new clothes, and ensured she had full meals every day. "You don't have to do this for me," she said one morning, looking at the abundant breakfast spread on the table. Lucas smiled. "I want to help." He was convincing. Every gesture, every word carefully crafted to make her trust him. And it was working. But what he didn't expect was what was happening to him. Grace was different. She wasn't like the gold-digging women he was used to. She wasn't impressed by his money or trying to win his favor for convenience. Even in her vulnerable situation, she held a quiet strength. And worst of all, he was starting to like that. One afternoon, Lucas returned to the mansion and found Grace in the garden. She was sitting on the grass, watching the flowers, her loose hair swaying in the wind. He approached quietly. "Do you like it here?" he asked. Grace smiled faintly. "It's beautiful. It doesn't even seem real." Lucas sat beside her. "Are you starting to get used to it?" She hesitated for a moment before answering. "I still feel out of place." He noticed the vulnerability in her voice. It was the first time she had said anything like that. Without thinking, he said, "You belong wherever you want to be, Grace." She looked at him, surprised. For the first time, Lucas wasn't sure if his words were part of the game or if they were coming from somewhere genuine inside him. And that bothered him. As nights passed, Lucas realized his strategy was changing. He didn't have to pretend as much anymore. He spent time with Grace willingly. He enjoyed hearing her stories and appreciated how she saw the world. But that didn't change the plan. He still needed to win her over completely. He still had to make her fall for him. He just didn't know if by then he'd already be too lost in the game himself. Lucas watched Grace from across the dining table, the soft glow of the light reflecting on her loose hair. She looked beautiful, wearing one of the dresses he had bought for her. The delicate blue contrasted with her fair skin, and there was something different in her eyes tonight. She seemed more at ease, more confident, just as he had hoped. Her confidence was the first step. Now he needed the second. Lucas had always had control over everything, but this time he felt something different, a tension in his chest, a weight. He ignored it and took a deep breath. "Grace." She lifted her eyes, a gentle smile on her lips. "Yes? I wanted to talk to you about something important." She could tell from his expression that it wasn't a casual conversation. Her smile faded slowly, replaced by a more focused look. Lucas held his wine glass, swirling the liquid slowly. He chose his words carefully. "Since I met you, my life has changed. I've seen your strength. I've seen how amazing you are." She frowned slightly. "You're different from anyone I've ever met. You don't care about money. You're not impressed by status. You're strong, but at the same time you have this softness that makes me want to be around you." Grace lowered her gaze for a moment, as if absorbing his words. I don't know what to say." He took her hand, intertwining his fingers with hers. "I want you to stay here forever." Silence hung between them. Grace swallowed hard. "Stay here?" Lucas looked into her eyes. "I want to marry you." The air seemed to freeze as the words left his mouth. Grace blinked a few times, as if trying to process what she had just heard. "Marriage?" Lucas nodded. "Yes." She pulled her hand back slightly, looking uncertain. "Do you really like me?" He hadn't expected that question. For a moment, his mind went blank. He had planned the proposal, the exact words, the tone of his voice, every detail, but he hadn't considered that she would ask that. Lucas realized he had to respond quickly. He held her face as if trying to reassure her. "Of course, I do. I would never have done this if I weren't sure of my feelings." Grace studied him in silence. She took a deep breath. "I just don't want to be a burden to you." Lucas kept his perfect mask intact. "You're not a burden. You are exactly what I need." She lowered her head. "I never thought someone like you would be interested in someone like me." Lucas felt a strange tightness in his chest. He hated to admit it, but that part was true. When he first saw her, he never imagined that one day he'd be asking her to marry him. But now he needed her. "I want to be with you, Grace. I want to protect you, to make sure you never struggle again." Grace blinked away a few tears and smiled softly. "Are you sure?" He gently ran his thumbs over her cheeks. "Yes. She took a deep breath, hesitated for a few seconds, and then I accept. Lucas felt a wave of relief. He had done it. But as he held her face, as he saw the emotion shining in Grace's eyes, guilt hit him like an unexpected blow. For a moment, he almost wished it were real. But it was too late to turn back now. The wedding happened without any big ceremony. Lucas arranged everything to be quick and discreet. No guests, no fuss, just signatures and a symbolic celebration. He justified it to Grace by saying he didn't like big events and wanted something intimate, just the two of them. She accepted without question. That was exactly what he wanted. But when he looked at Grace's radiant face as she said, "I do," Lucas felt something uncomfortable stirring inside him. She truly believed in this marriage, and that bothered him. The honeymoon was planned at an exclusive resort on a paradise island. The place looked like something out of a postcard. Crystal clear waters, wooden bungalows over the sea, the sunset painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. A perfect setting for a couple in love. But despite the breathtaking scenery, there was silence between them. Lucas felt an odd uneasiness. Grace acted like a loving wife, trying to get close to him, lightly touching his hand during walks, smiling whenever their eyes met. She trusted him. That should have made things easier. But somehow, it made everything harder. On their first night on the island, they had dinner on a private terrace overlooking the ocean. Grace wore a light dress, her hair down, her skin glowing in the candlelight. She looked nervous but happy. "I still can't believe this is happening," she said, pushing her plate aside. Lucas raised an eyebrow, pretending to be curious. "What do you mean? All of this? The wedding, the trip, us, it's so surreal." She smiled, and he could tell there was real emotion in her eyes. "I hope it's a good dream," he said, trying to keep his tone light. "The best one." Lucas forced a smile and took a sip of his wine. Grace reached across the table, slowly intertwining her fingers with his. "You're so quiet." He let out a soft sigh, pretending to be tired. "Just thinking about everything. It's a lot all at once." She nodded. "I imagine it must be hard to balance work and marriage." Lucas let out a low chuckle. "You have no idea." She laughed too, but her eyes studied him closely, as if trying to see past the mask he wore. Lucas looked away. He didn't want to be analyzed. And for the first time, he wondered if this marriage was becoming a problem for him too. That night, back at the bungalow, Lucas felt the tension growing. Grace was different. She seemed nervous but determined. Her posture was hesitant, her fingers touching her arm as if trying to find the courage to say something. Lucas, he was sitting on the edge of the bed, taking off his shoes, and stopped when he heard her voice. "Yes?" She took a deep breath. "I just wanted to say that. I'm happy. Really happy to have married you." Lucas remained silent. "I know it all happened so fast," she continued, taking a step closer. "But I like you. I really do." His heart pounded. She was truly in love with him, and that made something tighten in his chest. Grace moved closer and took his hand. "You do like me, don't you?" He held his breath for a moment. It was the same question she had asked before accepting the marriage, and he needed to answer quickly. Lucas lifted his hand and gently touched her face. "Of course I do." She closed her eyes for a moment, as if absorbing the moment. He knew what she expected from him. He knew what he was supposed to do, but for the first time he hesitated. Grace's eyes were full of trust. She would give herself to him without a second thought, and he didn't deserve that. Lucas took a deep breath and stepped back slightly. "You must be tired. It's been a long day." She blinked a few times, surprised. "Yes, but we have all the time in the world." Grace stayed silent for a few seconds before nodding slowly. He turned off the lights. In the darkness of the room, Lucas stayed awake for a long time. He didn't know what he was feeling. He only knew that something was changing, and that this could be a problem. In the days that followed, Grace tried to get closer. She would lightly touch his arm, smile when he spoke, and attempt to start conversations. But Lucas kept his distance. He wanted the marriage to seem real. But now that she was invested, he couldn't ignore the weight of the lie. Grace noticed the change. "You're acting strange with me," she said one afternoon, sitting on the bungalow porch, looking at the sea. Lucas sat beside her, holding a glass of wine. "What do you mean?" She sighed. "Ever since we got here, you've been distant. Did I do something wrong?" He looked at her, and her expression was genuinely hurt. He could have said he was just tired. He could have made up some excuse. But for the first time, the words felt too heavy to say. "No, Grace," he finally admitted. "You didn't do anything wrong." She kept her eyes on him. "Then what is it?" He looked away toward the ocean. "I just need some time to process everything." Grace nodded slowly. I understand. But he knew she didn't, and for the first time, he hated himself for it. The honeymoon passed in a blur. On the last day, as they packed their bags, Lucas noticed Grace was quieter. She still smiled, still tried to keep the mood light, but something about her had changed. And deep down, he knew it was because of him. He should have been happy. The marriage had happened, and soon he would get his hands on her fortune. But as he watched her in that moment, he felt like he was losing something he should have never tried to possess. On the flight back, Lucas stared out the window, lost in thought. Grace had fallen asleep beside him, her head resting on his shoulder. And it was then, in that instant, that he realized his plan had a flaw. He hadn't anticipated that he would start caring about her. And now it might be too late to go back. The plane landed smoothly on the private runway near Lucas's mansion. Grace woke up with a gentle impact, blinking a few times before sitting up straight. "Are we here already?" she asked softly, stretching. Lucas nodded but didn't look at her. His gaze was fixed on the window, his mind elsewhere. He didn't know exactly when he had lost control of the situation, but he knew something had changed. He should have felt satisfied. The marriage had gone as planned, and now it was just a matter of time before he secured everything he wanted. But then, why did he feel so restless? Beside him, Grace remained silent. The trip was supposed to be a honeymoon, but deep down she knew something was wrong. Lucas was distant, not just physically, but emotionally. And Grace wasn't the kind of woman who ignored things. As soon as they arrived at the mansion, Grace went inside first, slipping off her high heels and walking through the vast hall. She stopped in the middle of the room and turned to Lucas, who was handing the luggage to one of the staff. "Can we talk?" Lucas glanced at her quickly, but returned to giving instructions to the butler. "Can we talk later? I'm tired." "No," she said firmly. "I've waited long enough." Lucas paused, frowning. Grace crossed her arms. "You've been avoiding me. The entire trip, you treated me like I was a burden. What's going on?" Lucas sighed and ran his hands over his face. "Grace, it's nothing. Don't lie to me." Her voice was firm and determined. He lifted his gaze, meeting her intense eyes. Grace wasn't a submissive woman. She never had been. He should have anticipated that. "I just need space," he finally said. "Space?" she laughed, but there was no humor in her voice. "We just got married and you already need space?" He didn't answer. Grace took a step closer, facing him directly. "If you don't like me, just say it." The tension in the air was unbearable. Lucas felt a tightness in his chest, but didn't back down. "I didn't say that." "Then prove it." Silence stretched on for far too long. "That's what I thought," she said, her voice heavy with disappointment. Then, without saying anything else, she grabbed her suitcase and headed upstairs, leaving Lucas alone in the room. He should have felt relieved that she didn't push further. But instead, he felt like he had lost something important. That night, Grace stayed in the bedroom, but she didn't cry. She was no longer the helpless girl who accepted everything without question. She was willing to give Lucas some time. But she also wouldn't just sit around waiting for something that might never happen. She didn't know it yet, but her memory would soon start coming back. And when that happened, Lucas would have much more to deal with than just a cold marriage. In the following days, the mansion was filled with tension. Grace started going out more, exploring the city, visiting bookstores and cafes. Lucas watched her from a distance, feeling more and more irritated by the fact that she seemed fine without him. He knew he shouldn't care. But he did, until one day, everything changed. Grace was in the mansion's library, flipping through an old book, when a sharp headache hit her. She closed her eyes, pressing a hand to her forehead. Then flashes started appearing in her mind. A car, a wet road, voices shouting. A chill ran down her spine. What was that? Grace? She opened her eyes, startled. Lucas was standing at the door, watching her. "Are you okay?" She blinked a few times, trying to clear her mind. "Yes, just a headache." He frowned. "Do you want me to call a doctor?" She answered too quickly. "There's no need." Lucas stayed silent for a moment, but then nodded. "If you need anything, let me know." She just watched as he walked out of the library. Grace knew something inside her was trying to remember. And for the first time, she felt afraid of what she might discover. The flashes started coming more frequently. Grace saw faces she didn't recognize. She smelled scents that felt familiar. And most of all, she had the feeling that someone was waiting for her somewhere. She knew Lucas wouldn't tell her anything if she asked. So if she wanted answers, she would have to find them on her own. And that's exactly what she decided to do. The woman Lucas thought he had under control was about to change completely, and he wasn't ready for that. The ballroom was filled with lively conversations and clinking glasses, but for Grace, it all felt distant. She moved through the guests, smiling politely, but she didn't feel like she belonged in that world. Since they had returned from the honeymoon, Lucas had been different. Colder, more distant. She tried to ignore it, tried to convince herself that he just needed time. But the truth always finds a way to reveal itself. And that night, she would discover it in the worst way possible. She was walking past the bar when a loud laugh caught her attention. It's unbelievable how Grace is richer than her own husband. The comment made her heart stop. She frowned and slowly turned toward the man who had spoken. He was one of Lucas's friends, a middle-aged businessman with a flushed face from too much alcohol. "What?" Her voice came out louder than she expected. The man blinked a few times, realizing his mistake, and glanced at Lucas, who had suddenly tensed in his chair. "Oh, you didn't know?" The room seemed to grow quieter. Grace felt a chill run down her spine. She looked directly at Lucas, waiting for him to deny it. But he said nothing. Nothing. His silence was worse than any confirmation. "What do you mean, richer?" Her voice was firmer now. Lucas's friend gave a nervous chuckle and tried to brush it off. "Oh well, it's not exactly a secret. Lucas has known this for a long time." Lucas suddenly stood up, his jaw clenched, his eyes dark as a storm. "That's enough." But it was too late. All the pieces started falling into place in Grace's mind. The sudden marriage proposal, the way he was always in control, the way he avoided talking about emotions. She wasn't his wife. She was an investment. Her chest rose and fell rapidly, her heart pounding like a drum inside her. She stepped forward, feeling the anger take over her body. "You knew?" she asked, her voice trembling. Lucas closed his eyes for a second before looking at her. "Grace, let's talk in private." "No," she shouted, feeling the rage build up. "You knew from the start?" Lucas looked around, realizing everyone was watching. He didn't want to argue here, but Grace didn't care. "Tell me the truth, Lucas. Did you marry me for this? For the money?" He ran a hand through his hair, visibly frustrated. "Grace, please. Answer me." His eyes locked onto hers, and then he said the words she feared most. "Yes." Time seemed to stop. The world around her went silent. Grace felt the ground disappear beneath her feet. The air felt heavy, as if she were sinking into an ocean of lies. The man she loved, the man who had promised to protect her, never wanted anything but what she owned. She pressed her lips together, his step trying to hold back the overwhelming pain inside her. "But it's not like that anymore," he added quickly. "At first, yes, I wanted your money. But now?" She laughed, but it wasn't a laugh of amusement, it was bitter. "So what now? You expect me to believe you fell in love with me?" Lucas tried to move closer, but she stepped back. "Don't touch me." He stopped. She looked at him, seeing someone she no longer recognized. "I was such a fool." Lucas felt his chest tighten. "Grace, shut up." Her shout silenced everyone around them. The guests pretended not to be paying attention, but it was impossible to ignore what was happening. She took a deep breath, trying to maintain control. "I trusted you. I believed that, for the first time in my life, someone loved me without wanting anything in return." She ran her hand through her hair, her eyes shining with tears that refused to fall. "You didn't want a wife. You wanted a contract." Lucas opened his mouth to speak, but no words came, because everything she said was true. "I loved you," she whispered. Lucas felt the blow. "I know." Grace clenched her fists, "but I also know something else." She looked at him with cutting intensity. "You never deserved me." And with that, she turned and walked away. Lucas stood frozen, watching her disappear through the door, knowing that this time there was nothing he could do. He had lost her, and he might never get her back. Grace left Lucas's mansion without looking back. Her heart raced, her vision blurred by tears she tried in vain to hold back. The cold night air hit her face, but she barely felt it. Everything inside her was numb. The pain was deep, suffocating, as if she were sinking in an ocean of lies and betrayal. She didn't have a plan. She didn't know where to go. She just knew she had to leave. Lucas called out to her when he saw her crossing the mansion gates, but she ignored him. She never wanted to hear that voice again, and, for the first time, he didn't try to stop her. That hurt even more. Grace wandered aimlessly through the city. The streets were almost empty at that late hour. The signs from restaurants and stores flickered in colorful tones, reflecting on the wet pavement. The chilly wind made her body shiver, but she didn't care. She just kept walking and crying. The tears streamed freely down her face, silent, carrying a pain she never thought she would feel. Lucas was the first person she had truly trusted in a long time, and he had destroyed that. She felt stupid. She felt used. Every word, every gesture, every touch from him now seemed empty, fake. I was such a fool. She repeated it to herself as if trying to convince herself that it would make the pain less, but it didn't. The knot in her throat tightened with every step. How long had she been walking? She didn't know. When she finally stopped, she realized she was in an empty square. She sat on a wooden bench, wrapping her arms around herself. She stayed there for a long time. The sobs gradually faded, but the pain lingered. Then, like a sudden jolt, something changed inside her. She wouldn't cry for Lucas Smith anymore. She wouldn't shed another tear for a man who never truly loved her. She lifted her head and took a deep breath. The pain was still there, but now mixed with something different. Determination. She had to move forward, and she knew exactly what to do. A few minutes later, she found a hotel downtown. The receptionist looked at her with a mix of curiosity and concern. Her hair was messy, her eyes red from crying. "I need a room for the night," she said, her voice firm but still tinged with emotion. The man nodded and typed something on the computer. "Name for the reservation?" Grace hesitated for a moment. For the first time since Lucas had entered her life, she realized she could just be Grace, without his last name, without his shadow. "Grace Moreau," she finally said. The name felt heavy, strange, but it was hers. And now, she wanted to know exactly what that meant. That night, lying in the hotel bed, she opened her laptop and began searching for information about her family. And what she found took her breath away. She wasn't just wealthy. She had a family that was still looking for her, and now she knew she had to find them. Tomorrow, her new journey would begin. And this time, without Lucas. Lucas Smith was alone in the mansion's grand hall. The same mansion that, just hours ago, had been home to Grace. Now, the silence was deafening. The whiskey glass in his hand trembled slightly as he stared at the door she had walked through. His mind replayed the moment over and over, like an endless torture. Her look, the pain in her voice, the way her hands trembled when she realized the truth. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath, trying to push away the crushing weight growing inside him. But there was no escape. He had destroyed her. And with that, he had destroyed the only thing that truly mattered. Grace. She would never come back, and it was entirely his fault. The phone rang. Lucas ignored it the first time, but the persistent sound broke through his bubble of self-pity. He picked up the phone and answered. "What is it?" he asked, his voice hoarse. On the other end of the line, his friend and business partner, Ethan, sighed. "Man, what happened?" The dinner ended in chaos, and Grace left looking devastated. Lucas ran a hand over his face. "I messed everything up. I figured as much." Lucas remained silent. "Do you have feelings for her?" He didn't answer immediately, because the truth was brutal. "Yes," Ethan sighed. "Then why the hell didn't you stop her?" Lucas tightened his grip on the phone. "Because she deserves better than this." Ethan was quiet for a few seconds. "So what are you going to do now?" Lucas stared at the empty mansion. "I have no idea." But he knew one thing. He couldn't keep living like this. He had to change. And maybe, just maybe, if he did it right, Grace might forgive him. In the days that followed, Lucas buried himself in work, trying to fill the emptiness Grace had left behind. But it was useless. Everything he did, everything he saw, reminded him of her. The breakfasts they shared, the conversations in the garden, the looks they exchanged when they thought no one was watching. He missed her, more than he ever thought possible. And then, he decided to do something he had never done before. He went to his lawyer's office and gave up any claim to Grace's fortune. If he truly wanted to prove he loved her, he had to start there, by showing that he would never again take what wasn't his. But would that be enough to win her back? He didn't know, but he was willing to try, at any cost. And now he needed to find her, and fight for her. After days of searching for her parents' address, Grace had finally found it, and now she stared at the piece of paper in her hands. It was her parents' address, an address she had never even imagined existed. Since that night at the hotel, when she decided to look for her family, everything had changed. Discovering that her parents had never given up on her, that they had searched tirelessly, had shaken everything she thought she knew about herself. She had spent days gathering the courage to go to them. And now, standing in front of the massive gates of the Moreau estate, her heart pounded so hard she could feel it in her chest. Would her parents still recognize her? Did they still love her after all this time? Fear gripped her, but she couldn't run anymore. Taking a deep breath, she rang the doorbell. The door opened, and a middle-aged man in a perfectly tailored suit looked at her with a neutral expression. "May I help you?" Grace swallowed hard before answering. "My name is Grace. Grace Moreau." The butler's eyes widened. "Sir and Madame Moreau, come quickly." Seconds later, hurried footsteps echoed through the entrance hall. Her mother appeared first. Her eyes widened, her hand flew to her mouth, as if she were seeing a ghost. My God! Right behind her, her father stopped, his expression frozen in shock. "It can't be." Grace felt tears welling up. "It's me." She didn't have time to say anything else. Her mother ran to her, pulling her into a hug so tight it knocked the air from her lungs. "My daughter! My daughter!" she sobbed, clutching Grace against her chest. Her father stepped closer, as if afraid she would disappear. Then he wrapped his arms around both of them, and the three of them stood there, crying. It was as if time had stopped. What once seemed impossible was now real. She was home. After long minutes of tears and embraces, they sat in the mansion's grand living room. Her parents' eyes never left her, as if afraid she might vanish again. "We never stopped looking for you," her mother said, holding her hands tightly. Her father ran a hand over his face, visibly shaken. "We even thought that you had—" He hesitated, unable to finish the sentence. Grace took a deep breath. "I lost my memory." They exchanged stunned looks. "What happened?" her father asked. She swallowed hard before explaining everything. "There was an accident. After that, I didn't remember anything." Her parents listened in silence, each word hitting them like a blow. "I ended up living on the streets for years, not knowing who I was." Her mother let out a loud sob. "My God!" Her father stood up, pacing back and forth. "This is a nightmare. You went through all of that alone." Grace forced a weak smile. "But now I'm here." Her mother wiped away her tears and held Grace's face in both hands. "And we will never lose you again." In the days that followed, Grace stayed at her parents' house, trying to reconnect with them and adjust to her new reality. It felt strange being there, surrounded by luxury, with everything she needed at her fingertips. She spent hours exploring the house, trying to remember something, but her mind was a blur. Despite the joy of being reunited, a heavy weight still pressed on her chest. Lucas. She hadn't said a word about him to her parents. She didn't mention the marriage. It was a chapter of her life she still needed to resolve. But first, she had to decide who she wanted to be. One morning, her father called her into his office. "I want to talk to you about the future, Grace." She sat across from the large mahogany desk, observing her father, who seemed more serious than ever. "Now that you're back, I want you to take over the family business." Grace's eyes widened. "What? I'm getting old and tired, daughter. I've spent years waiting for the day I could trust Moreau Enterprises to you. That day has finally come." Grace felt the weight of responsibility settle on her shoulders. "Dad, I don't know anything about business. I've never done anything like this before." He smiled. "I'll teach you." She looked away, nervous. "And what if I'm not good at it?" He took her hands firmly. "You're a Moreau. It's in your blood." Grace took a deep breath. Running a company of that size seemed like a massive challenge. But on the other hand, it was her chance to start over, to leave the past behind, to be in control of her own destiny. She lifted her gaze, determined. "I'll do it." Her father smiled, proud. But then her heart sank. There was one last thing she needed to do before starting her new life. "But first, I need to go back to the city." Her parents exchanged confused glances. "Why?" her mother asked. Grace sighed. "There are things I need to resolve, things I left behind." Her parents hesitated but finally nodded. She hugged them, feeling stronger than ever, because this time, she was returning as a different woman. And she had one last matter to settle. Back in the city, Grace looked out the car window. The city seemed different. Or maybe she was the one who had changed. When she stepped out of the taxi and looked at the busy streets, she realized she no longer felt the weight of the past. She was a different woman now. Stronger. She had returned to settle what was left unresolved, but not to relive old feelings. She entered the building where she had rented a small apartment after leaving Lucas's mansion. The place was simple, but it was hers. For the first time in a long while, she felt in control of her own life. But little did she know, Lucas was still desperately searching for her. And fate would soon bring them face to face. Lucas Smith was on the brink of madness. He had looked for Grace everywhere. Hospitals, hotels, even shelters. But he hadn't found her. Each day without news of her was torture. He barely slept, barely ate. All he could do was replay the moment she walked out the door without looking back. and he feared she would never return. Then that afternoon, as he was absent-mindedly walking down a crowded street, a familiar sight made him stop abruptly. There she was, sitting at a cafe, smiling and chatting with a waiter. Lucas's blood boiled. He didn't think, he just acted. Grace was laughing at a comment from the waiter when a shadow loomed in front of her. "Don't you have anything better to do?" Lucas's cold, threatening voice cut through the air. The waiter frowned. "Excuse me, sir?" Lucas shot him a deadly glare. "Are you done with your job, or are you trying for something more?" The waiter, clearly uncomfortable, looked at Grace for an explanation. But she didn't need anyone to speak for her. "Lucas," her voice was firm and emotionless, "sit down." He hesitated for a moment, but obeyed. The waiter, sensing the tension, mumbled something about attending to another table and quickly left. Lucas crossed his arms, trying to hide his frustration. "You disappeared." Grace stared at him coldly. "I left. I didn't disappear." Lucas ran a hand through his hair, exhausted. "You don't understand. I looked for you everywhere." Grace tilted her head slightly. "And what did you expect, that I'd be waiting with open arms after everything you did?" Lucas felt the sting but kept his composure. "I made a mistake. I know that, but I had to find you." She let out a bitter laugh. "For what, Lucas? To manipulate me again? To make me believe more lies?" He took a deep breath, closing his eyes for a second. "I went to my lawyer," Grace frowned, "and I gave up any claim to your fortune. I don't want any of your money." For a moment, Grace saw sincerity in his eyes, but it didn't change anything. "And do you think that matters?" she said, her voice as cold as ice. Lucas remained silent. "Do you really think this will make me come back to you?" His silence was the answer. Grace sighed, shaking her head. "You don't get it, do you?" Lucas finally spoke, his voice quieter now. "I just want to fix things." She looked straight into his eyes. "Some things can't be fixed." The pain on Lucas's face was clear. Grace picked up her bag, stood up, and looked at him one last time. "Goodbye, Lucas." Then she walked away, leaving him alone at the table, devastated. In the days that followed, Lucas tried to keep himself busy, burying himself in work, meetings, and endless business affairs. But nothing was enough to push away reality. Grace was gone, and this time she wasn't coming back. The image of her walking out of the cafe without looking back still burned in his mind. The cold tone of her voice, the firmness in her words, the way she looked at him as if he were a complete stranger. He had lost her. And now, fate was about to deliver one final blow. It was late afternoon when one of his assistants walked into his office holding a brown envelope. "This just arrived for you, sent directly from the Moreau attorneys." Lucas frowned as he took the envelope. His heart beat faster, as if it already knew what he was about to see. With trembling hands, he opened the envelope and pulled out the papers inside. And then, his world fell apart. Divorce papers. He read the words once, twice, 3 times, hoping the meaning would somehow change. But it was real. Grace wanted a divorce. Lucas dropped the papers onto his desk and ran his hands over his face. He knew this moment would come, but he wasn't prepared for the crushing pain that came with it. For a moment, he considered signing the papers immediately, accepting what was inevitable. But then, something inside him refused to give up. He needed to see her one last time. Night had already fallen when Lucas parked his car in front of the building where Grace was now living. He looked up at the apartment lights, trying to gather courage. She didn't want to see him, but that didn't matter. He walked up to her door and knocked a few times. Nothing. He knocked again, harder. Seconds later, the door opened. Grace stood there, wearing comfortable clothes, her hair loose, her expression serious. For a moment, Lucas was speechless. "What do you want?" Her voice was cold. He held up the envelope. Grace crossed her arms. "And?" Lucas took a deep breath. "I wanted to hear it from you." "Do you really want this?" She didn't hesitate. "Yes." That single word cut like a blade. Lucas lowered his gaze for a moment before finally speaking. "I'll sign it." Grace kept her expression firm, but he noticed a slight tremor in her breathing. "Good." Lucas closed his eyes for a moment before continuing. "But before I go, there's something you need to know." Grace waited, saying nothing. "I'm not here to beg. I'm not here to ask you to come back." She frowned slightly, surprised. "Then why are you here?" He let out a heavy sigh. "Because you deserve to hear this from me." She remained silent. Lucas hesitated, then spoke with sincerity. "I was a fool. I did everything wrong. But what I felt for you was never a lie." Grace looked away. "That doesn't change anything." He nodded slowly. "I know." She took a deep breath. "Thank you for coming." "Now go, Lucas." He stood there for a moment, as if trying to memorize her face one last time. Then, without another word, he turned and left. Grace closed the door, leaning against it, her eyes shut. She had made the right choice, so why did her heart feel so heavy? The divorce was finalized days later. Lucas Smith was now officially a free man. But for the first time in his life, he didn't want that freedom. He had lost Grace. And the worst part? He knew it was his fault. For days, he withdrew from everything, trying to process what had happened. But slowly, something inside him started to change. He couldn't keep being the same selfish, cold man he had always been. Grace had made him see that. And if he could never have her back, at the very least, he wanted to become a better man than the one who lost her. Lucas started his transformation quietly. He began treating the people around him better. His employees noticed the change. He listened more, showed more empathy, even smiled. Something rare before. But that wasn't enough. He wanted to do more. That was when he started visiting charities, helping those in need. At first, everyone was surprised to see a millionaire businessman in shelters and social projects. But he wasn't there for status or to improve his image. He wanted to change. The more time he spent with those people, listening to their stories, the more he realized how much of his life he had wasted chasing money and power. Now, none of that seemed to matter as much. But no matter how hard he tried to move on, one person never left his thoughts. Grace. He saw her at every corner, in every memory, and deep down, he knew he would never stop loving her. Meanwhile, Grace had finally moved into her parents' home and taken over the family business. The challenge was immense, but she was determined. Her father taught her every day about business, strategies, and leadership. Surprisingly, she adapted quickly. Grace became a strong and admired leader, earning everyone's respect. But even with her busy new life, there was something she couldn't ignore. Lucas. No matter how hard she tried to forget him, her heart always betrayed her. She hated to admit it, but she still loved him. And that scared her, because she knew she couldn't just go back to him. He would have to prove that he had changed. And as far as she knew, he never would. Months later, Grace was invited to a major business event. It was her first big appearance as CEO of Moreau Enterprises. She knew all eyes would be on her. And for that reason, she prepared like never before. She wore an elegant red dress, her hair in a sophisticated bun, and flawless makeup. She wanted the world to know that she was now a woman in control. But she had no idea that night would change everything. Lucas hadn't expected to see her there. He had only attended the event at a friend's request, never imagining that fate would play a trick on him. And then, there she was. Stunning. Grace looked even more beautiful than he remembered. His heart raced the moment he saw her. She moved through the room as if she had always belonged there. And for a moment, he noticed something he hadn't seen before. She was no longer the same woman he had known. She had become strong, independent, a woman who didn't need him. Lucas swallowed hard and took a deep breath before approaching her. Grace. She turned at the sound of his voice. For a second, he saw the shock in her eyes. His heart raced, but she quickly composed herself. Lucas, she said politely but distant, you look incredible. She gave a slight smile. Thank you. There was a brief silence. Lucas wanted to say so much. He wanted to tell her everything that had changed in his life. He wanted to tell her that he still loved her. But he didn't have the chance. A man approached. Grace, would you like to dance? She looked at the investor and smiled. Of course. And she walked away, leaving Lucas alone. He watched her leave, feeling the weight of reality sink in. Grace had moved on. But was it really the end? Or was there still one last chance for them? Lucas didn't know the answer, but he wasn't ready to give up. The morning began quietly at the Moreau mansion. Grace was in her private office, reviewing reports and planning strategies for the company's upcoming investments. Her father had entrusted her with big decisions, and she wanted to prove she was capable of leading. But deep down, something still bothered her. No matter how hard she tried to concentrate, Lucas lingered in her thoughts. She wanted to believe that everything she felt for him was in the past. But was that true? Her life turned upside down when her father abruptly entered the office with a serious expression. Grace, I need an explanation. Now. She looked up from the computer, surprised by his firm tone. What happened? He tossed an envelope onto the desk. Grace frowned and picked up the papers. As she began to read, her face turned pale. It was a complete dossier about her marriage to Lucas. The secret marriage. The divorce. Everything was there. Her parents had discovered the truth. She slowly lifted her eyes and saw her father's furious expression. You married that man and never told us? Grace's stomach churned. Dad, why did you hide this from us? He interrupted, clearly disappointed. He used you, deceived you, and you never told us a thing. Grace's mother entered the room right behind him, looking concerned. Richard, calm down. But he ignored her. I want to know everything, Grace. Now. Grace took a deep breath. There was no point in hiding it anymore. So she told them everything. From the fire that brought her into Lucas's life, to the marriage of convenience, the betrayal, the divorce, and the months spent trying to forget him. Her father was silent for a moment. Then he slammed his hand on the desk. I can't believe that scoundrel did this to you. Grace looked away. I didn't want to believe it either. Her mother, who had been listening in silence, asked gently, Do you still love him? The question hit Grace like a blow. She hesitated, but the truth was there, inside her. Yes, she admitted in a whisper. Her father scoffed, crossing his arms. That man doesn't deserve your love, Grace. I know, she replied, looking down. Her mother exchanged a glance with her husband, then stepped closer to Grace. Sweetheart, I know he made mistakes, but you said yourself that he's changed. What if he truly regrets everything? Grace closed her eyes for a moment. I can't trust him anymore. Silence filled the room. Her mother sighed and held her hand. Maybe. Trusting him isn't something that happens overnight. But what if he really is a different man? Do you want to live with that doubt forever? Grace didn't answer, because, for the first time in months, she was beginning to question her own decision. That night, Grace couldn't sleep. Her emotions were all over the place. She loved Lucas. That was a fact. But could she trust him again? She needed an answer. And fate wouldn't take long to give her a sign. The next morning, while having breakfast, she received an unexpected call. It was from one of Moreau Enterprises' investors. Grace, I wanted to inform you about something that might interest you. She frowned. What is it? Lucas Smith has been funding and actively working with several charities and social projects. He's been helping the homeless, creating job training programs, and investing his own money in humanitarian causes. Grace went silent for a moment. Is he doing this for publicity? No. He's refused interviews and avoided any exposure. He really seems to want to help. She hung up the phone, deep in thought. Lucas had always been a man obsessed with money and power. But now, he was dedicating his life to helping others? She never imagined he was capable of something like that. And it left her more confused than ever. Because for the first time, she wondered, what if Lucas really had changed? And if it was true, what did that mean for her? The morning started with an uneasy silence in the Moreau mansion. Grace sat on the living room sofa, a forgotten cup of coffee between her hands. Her thoughts were far away, trapped in a storm of memories and emotions she couldn't control. Lucas, he was changing. She knew it. The calls she received about his involvement in charities, the way he had stepped away from the business world to help others, it was hard to believe, but the truth was right in front of her. Lucas Smith was no longer the cold, calculating man she had met. But was that enough? Could she trust him again? She sighed, rubbing her temples. Her mind was at war with itself. But before she could find an answer, the phone rang. She answered without thinking. Miss Moreau? The voice on the other end was tense. Yes, this is she. Who's calling? This is Central Hospital. We have news about Lucas Smith. Grace felt her heart stop. What happened? He was in a serious car accident. His condition is critical. The phone nearly slipped from her hands. What? He was taken to the emergency room and is in surgery right now. Grace's world crumbled. Without thinking, she stood up, already walking toward the door. She needed to see him. Just as she was about to leave, a firm voice stopped her. Where are you rushing off to? It was her father. He stood at the entrance to the room, arms crossed, his expression stern. Grace didn't have time for arguments. Lucas was in an accident, she said quickly. His condition is serious. Her father's face hardened, but he didn't move. And what does that have to do with you? Grace frowned. Dad, I have to go to him. No, you don't. She felt anger rising inside her. How can you say that? Because that man used you, Grace. He deceived you, betrayed you. Why do you still care about him? She clenched her fists, fighting back tears. Because I love him. The confession slipped out before she could stop it. Her father remained silent, but his expression stayed firm. He may have made mistakes, but he's changed, Grace said, her voice shaking. I know he has. And does that erase what he did to you? No, but he's become a better man. Her father scoffed, running a hand through his hair. Grace, don't do this to yourself. She lifted her chin. Dad, I'm not asking for your permission. Then, without waiting for a reply, she walked out the door and got into her car. She couldn't waste any more time. Lucas needed her, and she needed him. The drive to the hospital felt like an eternity. Her heart pounded, and with every mile she drove, her fear grew. What if he didn't survive? What if she never got the chance to tell him how she felt? The thought terrified her. When she finally arrived at the hospital, she parked in a hurry and rushed inside. "Lucas Smith," she told the receptionist, almost out of breath. "Where is he?" The woman checked the system and sighed. "He's in surgery." Grace felt her legs weaken. "How is he?" "Lost a lot of blood, and the doctors are doing everything they can." Grace placed her hand over her chest, feeling a sharp pain. She sat on a bench in the waiting room, her heart racing, overwhelmed with despair. What if Lucas didn't survive? What if she never saw him smile again? She buried her face in her hands, holding back tears. All she wanted was more time. More time to forgive him. More time to love him. The hours passed slowly. With each dragging minute, Grace's anxiety grew. She kept looking toward the emergency corridor at every sound of footsteps, hoping for news. But none came. Then, as night began to fall, she saw something unexpected. Her parents entering the hospital. She immediately stood up, her face tense. "If you're here to convince me to leave, you're wasting your time." Her father exchanged a glance with her mother before stepping closer. But instead of his usual firmness, his face showed something different. Understanding. "Grace, we're here to support you." She blinked, surprised. "What?" Her mother moved closer, holding her hands. "We understand that you love him," she said gently. "And even though he hurt you, he's proven that he's changed." Grace's eyes stung with tears. "But you don't have to forgive him now," her father said. "But we can't deny that he's become a different man." Grace took a deep breath, feeling a wave of emotions wash over her. She looked down the corridor toward the closed surgery doors. She didn't know what would happen next. But she knew one thing. She wouldn't run away anymore. She would wait for him, because deep down she had always loved him, and nothing would change that. The night dragged on, and the hospital remained steeped in an unsettling silence. Grace sat on the hard bench in the waiting room, her elbows on her knees, hands clasped as if in prayer. Every minute without news felt like torture. Her parents sat quietly beside her, respecting her anguish. The only thing filling that empty space was the suffocating weight of uncertainty. Hours later, a doctor finally emerged from the surgery room. Grace stood up so quickly she nearly lost her balance. "Doctor, how is he?" The doctor looked at her and her parents before taking a deep breath. "The surgery was long, but we managed to stabilize him." Grace felt her legs go weak. "Does that mean he's going to be okay?" The doctor hesitated. "We can't say for sure yet. He lost a lot of blood and is sedated. The next few days will be critical." Grace clutched her chest, trying to control her panic. "Can I see him?" The doctor nodded. "Just for a few minutes. He's still unconscious." Grace didn't think twice. She followed the doctor down the cold, white hallway to the room where Lucas was being treated. Her heart pounded harder with each step. And when she entered the room, a lump formed in her throat. Lucas was lying in the bed, surrounded by machines monitoring his vital signs. There were bandages on his face, his arm was in a cast, and his chest rose and fell unevenly. He looked so fragile, so different from the confident, imposing man he had always been. Grace approached slowly and pulled up a chair beside the bed. She gently took his hand and gave it a light squeeze. "You have to wake up, Lucas." Her voice was soft, almost a whisper. "I'm not ready to lose you." She lowered her head, closing her eyes tightly, trying to hold back tears. "I spent months trying to hate you, trying to forget you. But the truth is," she paused, feeling the weight of her words, "I never could." She took a deep breath and looked at him. "So please, don't leave me now." The following days were a long wait. Grace barely left the hospital. She spent hours by Lucas's side, holding his hand, telling him stories about her childhood, the company, anything that made her feel he was still there. Her parents went home at night, but she refused to leave. "I need to be here when he wakes up," she said every time. And then, after 4 days of uncertainty, Lucas finally opened his eyes. The first thing he saw was a white ceiling. The second was a hand holding his. He blinked a few times, trying to adjust his vision, and then his heart raced. Grace. She was there, looking at him with teary eyes and a relieved smile. "You came back," she whispered. Lucas tried to speak, but his throat was dry. She picked up a glass of water and helped him drink. He watched her for a moment, taking in her presence. "You stayed here the whole time?" Grace hesitated, then nodded. Lucas closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them again, something was different. I thought I'd never see you again. Grace gave a small smile. I thought the same. Lucas swallowed hard, feeling a tightness in his chest. Do you forgive me? She took a deep breath. Lucas? But before she could finish, the door opened. Her parents walked in and the moment was interrupted. But for the first time, Grace felt something shift inside her. Something she could no longer ignore. She still loved him, and maybe, just maybe, she was ready to admit it. The days that followed were a real test for Grace. Lucas was recovering, but he still needed time to regain his strength. She remained by his side, visiting him every day, bringing him coffee, talking about little things, trying to fill the silence between them. But deep down, she knew something bigger was growing inside her. Doubt, fear, and above all, the love that had never truly gone away. Lucas watched Grace from his hospital bed. He never expected her to be there when he woke up. But she stayed, and that meant more than anything. But would she really forgive him? Did he still have a chance? He didn't want to pressure her, so he waited for her to make the decision on her own. Because this time, if she chose him, it would be out of love and not out of obligation. One morning, while Lucas was sleeping, Grace stepped out of the hospital for some fresh air. She walked slowly through the garden, lost in thought. That's when she felt a presence beside her. Her father. He remained silent for a moment before speaking. You're different, Grace. She looked at him. Different how? He sighed. Lighter. She lowered her gaze, thoughtful. Dad, what if I'm making a mistake? He studied her for a moment before answering. Then it'll be a mistake you'll never regret. Grace frowned. What do you mean? He gave a small smile. You've spent so much time trying to be strong that you forgot your heart also needs room to feel. She took a deep breath, feeling tears threaten to fall. I'm afraid of getting hurt again. I know, he nodded. But sometimes, love is worth the risk. Grace remained silent, absorbing her father's words. And for the first time, she began to accept the truth she had been trying to ignore. She had never stopped loving Lucas, and maybe it was time to choose what she truly wanted. That night, when she returned to the hospital, Lucas was awake, looking out the window. She walked into the room and sat beside him. He turned to look at her, a small smile on his lips. Hey, she replied softly. There was silence between them until Lucas finally spoke. I don't know what's going to happen between us, Grace. Her heart pounded. Neither do I. He took a deep breath. But I do know one thing. I love you. She closed her eyes for a moment, feeling her heart race in her chest. Then she looked at him and smiled. Because for the first time, she knew exactly what she wanted. And this time, it was her choice. The choice of the heart. The hospital was left behind, along with months of pain, regret, and uncertainty. Lucas had fully recovered and was ready to move forward. But this time, not alone. After everything they had been through, after all the lies, separations, and reunions, Grace had finally made her choice. She chose Lucas, not because she needed him, but because she loved him. And he, in turn, knew he would never make the same mistakes again. He would love her the way she deserved to be loved. And for that, there was only one thing left to do. That night, Lucas took Grace to a special place. It was a secret garden, a hidden paradise outside the city. The sky was filled with thousands of stars, and the soft glow of lanterns hanging from the trees created a magical setting. A violin played in the background, and a gentle breeze brushed through Grace's hair. She looked around, enchanted. Lucas, this is beautiful. He smiled, but there was something different in his eyes. Something deep. Something that made her heart race. I needed this moment to be perfect, he said, taking her hand. Grace frowned slightly, trying to understand what he meant. And then Lucas knelt down. Time seemed to stop. Grace brought a hand to her mouth, surprised. His eyes shone with emotion. Grace Moreau, I've made mistakes that haunt me every day. I lost you when I needed you the most, and I thought I'd never get a second chance. But fate proved to me that true love always finds its way back. She felt tears well up in her eyes. I love you, Grace. In a way, I never thought I could love anyone. He took out a velvet box and opened it, revealing a stunning ring. Will you marry me? For real this time. No lies, no secrets, just us and the love that has always been between us. Grace looked at him, feeling every word touch her soul. Then, without hesitation, she smiled with tears in her eyes. Yes, Lucas laughed in relief before standing up and wrapping her in a tight embrace. When their lips met, there was no doubt left. This time, it was real. This time, it was forever. A few days later, the big day arrived. The ceremony took place outdoors in a flower-filled field with a view of the ocean. The sun was setting on the horizon, painting the sky with golden and orange hues. Grace walked down the white aisle, holding a bouquet of roses, dressed in a stunning lace gown that seemed made just for her. Lucas waited for her at the altar, dressed in an elegant black suit, his eyes shining with pure happiness. The guests were moved, but nothing compared to what Grace and Lucas felt. When she reached the altar, he took her hands and smiled. "You look beautiful," he whispered. She returned the smile. "And you're finally where you belong." The officiant began the ceremony, and when it was time for the vows, Lucas took a deep breath and held her hands firmly. "I've had everything money can buy, but I never knew what it meant to be truly rich until I met you." Grace's eyes filled with tears. "You taught me that love isn't something you buy or negotiate, it just happens. I promise, here and now, that I'll never be the man who lost you again. I'll be the man who chooses you, every day of my life." Grace smiled, feeling her heart overflow with love. Then it was her turn. "I loved you before I even knew who I was, and I kept loving you, even when I tried to deny it to myself." She squeezed his hands. "But now I choose to love you. I choose to trust you. I choose to share my life with you, forever." Lucas closed his eyes for a moment, overcome with emotion. The officiant smiled. "I now pronounce you husband and wife." Lucas didn't wait for permission. He pulled Grace into a passionate kiss as the guests cheered. It was a kiss filled with promises. Promises of a future together. Promises of true love. And this time, a love that would last forever. Do you think Grace made the right choice in forgiving Lucas? Share your thoughts in the comments. Rate this story from 0 to 10 and subscribe to the channel. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell to follow all our stories. Check out more heartwarming stories by clicking here on the final screen.